Hi, everyone. So this is the start of your module 1B, and we're going to talk about starting the research process and what all of that entails. So without further ado, let's get started. So we're going to talk a little bit about bias in research to start, and that we all have biases and all research has some level of bias and limitations, but we have tactics to mediate this. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how you should start to approach thinking about your research questions moving forward and how you should choose them. So we know that all people and all contexts have bias. This comes from everybody's unique positionality or the individual factors that make up the way that they walk in the world. It comes from their status in the world, their demographics, their resources, these power structures that we know influence people's lives, the institutions that they operate within. So everyone's positionality and their lived experience with the world frames their biases and the way that they approach producing questions, knowledge, the way they write, all of these things. The research, broadly, research and people that produce research do have bias, but our job as researchers within this scientific reproducible framework is to minimize all of those biases through systematic approaches and through accepted approaches by the broader scientific community, right? So these standards that we hold ourselves to limit and mitigate the issues of bias within research. And we'll talk about what that means in our maybe current political context, well, where a lot of individuals think that the academy and the university is a very biased place and they're only producing certain kinds of knowledge. But what I'm trying to kind of convey to you guys is that through rigorous scientific method and through robust research, we can mitigate those things, and we're producing research in a way that is reliable and trustworthy to the broader public. Again, we do mitigate these biases through systematic and transparent research practices. Additionally, after your research is concluded, this comes in the form of peer review. So if you want to be published as an academic, you have to go through the peer review process of an academic journal, which I alluded to in a previous video, which essentially means that other academics are going to grill and look at your work and make sure that you followed all the appropriate steps and that your research is reliable and trustworthy. This is exactly why we can trust academic journals more than a blog of somebody that's just kind of writing about what they think, or even just kind of off cuff doing some data analysis of their own, is that they don't have that vetting process of peer review. This is why, in a lot of ways, we can trust the academy over other sources of knowledge and research, right? Because not only is that research garnered in a very specific way with very high standards, but there also is a lot of moments where if you did things incorrectly or unethically, it'll be caught ideally by the peer review process. Political science specifically, let's kind of get into this kind of world that we're operating within a little bit more concretely. We know politics is the who gets what, when, and how of the world. It's the power struggle over scarce resources and the process of allocating power within society. Political science specifically is then adding that scientific method to the study of these things, the study of power, resource allocation, the who gets when, where, why, and how. We're then applying the scientific method to these things. This can be looking at institutions like Congress. You can look at political behavior, whether or not people are voting or protesting, attitudes, right? How much somebody likes a given candidate or whether they like certain policies. We also can look at political economic systems. So there's a lot of different ways that political science looks. In our particular context and in the scope of this class, it's designed around looking at American political behavior and attitudes, but you could even easily translate that to other political contexts, particularly other data-rich political contexts and other countries. But essentially, our focus in this class is going to be mostly political behavior and attitudes, but it's just to say that political science is applying this idea of a scientific method to the study of politics. I kind of alluded to this earlier, but there are a lot of critiques of academic studies, particularly coming from conservative ideological camps. You'll see these in the media fairly often, where there are critiques of professors in the academy, because a lot of professors are liberal, right? They hold certain ideological viewpoints and policy viewpoints in their personal scope, right? The university is not a partisan or ideological institution in the way that I think a lot of times it's claimed. And I want you guys to think about the ways in which professors, particularly those trained in the scientific method, are looking to mitigate and reduce their personal biases in the way that they approach their work. There are moments where you pick research topics that are interesting to you, but the ways in which you study them are not to confirm your personal beliefs, but it's to produce broader knowledge. And sometimes you find information that's contradictory to your personal inclinations, right? But that's good research because you followed the scientific method and you found something that may be actually a real truth about the world. So the scientific method and the process of peer review help us account for any sort of personal biases that may arise, and it keeps academic research robust and reliable. So I want to buck a little bit against this idea that the research that's produced within the academy and within the broader scientific community is ideological inherently, right? So how do you start to choose, right? So we're in this space, we understand that we have biases, but we're using the scientific method to hone in, make our stuff reproducible, reliable. But then we have this choice of actually kind of choosing what we want to study. I first want to encourage you guys to pick stuff that suit your interests. If you start to pick research topics that don't actually really interest you very much, I think you're going to find that your bandwidth and your ability to keep sticking with them is going to be pretty limited, right? I can think of times in my academic career where I was working on projects that maybe I had an advisor or mentor that was really excited about it, and I wasn't very excited about it. And it kept me from being really productive on that front because I wasn't studying stuff that I was very interested in. So it keeps you kind of checked into the research process. I encourage you to pick things that you're excited about. You should be basing it kind of broadly on the extant literature or the other research in the field. So you're producing stuff that fits gaps, right? So we've all studied X, Y, and Z, but nobody's looked at this other factor, W, and I think that's really related to this, right? So you don't want to be reproducing the same things over and over and over again. You want to be thinking of things that are filling gaps in the literature, or also just extend earlier literature on a particular topic, but you want to be putting your own new novel spin on things. So that comes from reading. We'll talk about that. It's like forming good research questions and really kind of thinking critically about producing new and novel research comes from really knowing where the literature is at. When I say the literature, I mean all of the existing research, peer-reviewed research on the subject. And I also want you guys to think a little bit about like reverse engineering your research question in a lot of ways. What does that mean? It means that you want to pick stuff that you know that you can actually test, right? If you're talking about doing some big natural experiment, which means an experiment out in the wild about voter turnout, and you want to see in this given election, if you do this, more people show up, like that's not, possible in the scope of our class, right? So you want to think about things that are reasonable within your limits as an undergraduate at Cal Poly Pomona and within the time frame that we have, right? So you want to reverse engineer the question in the sense that you want to know that you can actually enact it, right? So a little bit of practice. In the beginning, before this video, I asked you to brainstorm some behaviors that you maybe would like to interrogate or test, right? These political behaviors and stuff. Now, knowing that you can kind of frame a little bit based on your interests and then maybe based on the literature and this sort of reverse engineering, would you want to change them? Now, you don't have to overtly change them, but I want you to think about, well, maybe I didn't do any reading on that first. I need to go and do some reading and see if somebody's already studied that. I need to hit the literature. Or maybe you think about the fact that it's probably not doable in the scope of the class, right? And just be like, acknowledge that that is a real limitation for us and think about that moving forward as you create new research questions. So when you're picking these things, you have to have a clear vision of how to test them and then also have an understanding of where the literature is at. So in this particular lecture, we talked about how to get started with the research process. And now we're going to move forward to talk about building a good research question.